Occupancy and possession. This section has to deal with whether or not the buyer is taking the property with either the seller or the tenant occupying the property after closing. If we're operating under paragraph 6A, then the tenant is receiving the property with nobody occupying it. This section also talks about pre-occupancy for if the buyer is going to be occupying the property before the closing. And they reference Rider T here for the pre-occupancy addendum. I normally recommend not to do pre-occupancy agreements. It's not a great idea to have the buyer in the house before the closing happens. What happens if they don't close? Does the seller now have to evict them? If anybody's thinking about doing a pre-occupancy agreement, that's something that we really need to discuss and make sure that everybody's on the same page before it happens, because from a legal standpoint, I usually recommend against that. Section 6B, they've added in reference to seasonal and short-term vacation rentals now. As we all know, Airbnb is pretty big down here. Seasonal rentals are very big. They've also added a new addendum that governs seasonal and short-term vacation rentals. So if you do have a property that has seasonal rentals and short-term vacation rentals, you're going to want to use that addendum. That addendum has a couple of different options on it. The first part says the seller may or may not, after the effective date and prior to closing, enter into new or renewal seasonal or vacation rental occupancy agreements at market rate terms for occupancies of the property by third parties after closing. So if you have a property where the seller has seasonal rentals, or they do Airbnb or other types of vacation rentals, you're going to want to have this addendum, because you need to specify whether or not the seller has the right to enter into new rental agreements that will extend after closing. So you can imagine a 6-month rental that will take place partially while the contract is in effect and partially after closing. Does the seller have the right to enter into that agreement? If we check that yes, they have that right, then the next part asks, is it only with buyer's approval or without buyer's prior approval? If you're on the buyer side, you obviously want it with buyer's prior approval, because you don't want the seller to enter into a rental agreement that you think you can get a better term on, potentially. The other thing is, you don't want sellers to just enter into agreements that would be unfavorable towards the closing and would prevent or delay closing. So you might want the buyers to be able to have the right to approve or deny that. From the seller side, you obviously want the right to be able to do this, because you want to be able to collect rent during the course of the contract if one of your leases is going to expire. That being said, if the buyer's intention is to go in there and renovate the property, the buyer's not going to want to have any rentals in there after closing. The second part of this addendum talks about management agreements. A lot of seasonal rentals and vacation rentals have a management company who's actually managing the rental and coming up with the agreement. If there's a management agreement in place, this contract and this addendum is now saying that the buyer has to observe the terms of that agreement if there are rentals that are subject to the agreement after the closing. I still recommend having an assignment of that management agreement to get the buyer on board with that management company and figure out the terms of that agreement. On line 80 here, it says, except that tenant estoppel letters shall not be required on seasonal or short-term vacation rentals. So typically in this section, when you have a tenant, we're operating by standard D here. In the back of the contract are all the standards. There's sort of like definitions, and sometimes they explain how certain sections are supposed to work. When there's a tenant, the landlord is supposed to be providing the buyer with the lease, and then the buyer is supposed to be getting a tenant estoppel from the tenant. And the reasoning behind that is for the tenant to sort of verify that the lease that was presented to the buyer is correct. When you have short-term and seasonal rentals, tenant estoppels are not going to be required. Section 7 for assignability, they added in the line that says if no box is checked, then buyer may not assign this contract. If you forget to check off the boxes in this section, then the contract will not be assignable.